As of October 22nd, the Memphis Grizzlies are without Steven Adams for the entirety of the season thanks to surgery on a knee injury. Adams has now joined fellow big man Brandon Clarke, who himself is quite possibly out for the entirety of the season thanks to a torn Achilles, and that hasn't even mentioned or included Ja Morant, who is suspended for the first 25 games of the season. That's a tough list to go into a season, and a season in which the Grizzlies already had some serious depth issues, and those issues are now being exacerbated in the front court thanks to these injuries. So let's discuss the combined impact of no Steven Adams and Brandon Clarke, what depth options the Grizzlies have to get through this season in the front court, and potential trade options to aid these lack of depth options. Now, of course, Bane and Jaren Jackson Jr. are healthy, they're ready to go heading into the season, and that should keep the Grizzlies afloat and at least in the playoff picture. But there is no doubt the loss of Steven Adams combined with Brandon Clarke is going to hurt, and it's going to show effects on the court. Steven Adams is one of the best rebounders in the league. Last year he averaged 11.5 a night, with over 5 of those being on the offensive glass, totals that placed him 6th and comfortably 1st in the league, respectively. That's not something that can be easily replaced. His impact on the glass was a big reason, and the most significant reason, for the Grizzlies being 2nd in rebounds per game and 4th in offensive rebounds per game last year. Adams is not a typical rim protector, he's not an elite shot blocker, he's not some guy with a big vertical, but his impact on defense is significant. Sure, Jaren Jackson Jr. is a very good defender and a depoy type defender, but this Grizzlies defense, and specifically their front court defense, is very good because of Jaren Jackson Jr. and Steven Adams. Over the past 2 years and 2,900 minutes that Jaren Jackson Jr. and Steven Adams have been on the court together, they have posted a defensive rating of 108.2. That would have been the best in the league last year for a team. Steven Adams' effect and stats really show up on the glass as well, as we previously mentioned, and it really shows up for the team as a whole, as the Grizzlies' rebound rate was comfortably 1st in the league when Steven Adams was on the floor last year. When Steven Adams was on the bench, they were 27th. So this isn't a matter of when Steven Adams is on the floor, he gets the boards. When Jaren Jackson's on the floor and Adams is not, Jaren gets the boards. No, Adams is that guy. He is an elite tier rebounder, and they're going to miss that significantly with him not being on the floor. He's not flashy, and sometimes what he does on a night-to-night basis doesn't even show up in the box score. But Adams makes the little plays, the hustle plays, that allow for winning basketball, and his presence will be severely missed on this team. Ideally, in the case of a Steven Adams injury, the Grizzlies would look to Brandon Clarke to fill plenty of the void, especially in the rebounding department. I mean, we've seen this even when Steven Adams has been healthy in past years in the postseason, where Brandon Clarke has come in and started and filled a lot of that role. But as previously mentioned, Brandon Clarke remains out with an Achilles tear with no timeline to return. Most recent updates would indicate the Grizzlies would consider it a success if Clarke sees the court this season, but by no means is that a guarantee that he will see the court this season. For a team already devoid of high-quality depth in their front court, no Brandon Clarke and no Steven Adams is a brutal, brutal blow, and one that will be very, very difficult to overcome. Of course, now all eyes look to Jaren Jackson Jr. Jaren will already have to pick up some of the offensive load during the 25-game absence of Ja Morant, but there is plenty more responsibility for him to take on now, thanks to the injury of Steven Adams. Jaren has never averaged over 30 minutes a game throughout a season, throughout his NBA career. With 2 rotational pieces out in the front court, that may have to change. The other concern for Jaren going into this season, with the rebounding of Steven Adams gone, is the lack of rebounding from Jaren Jackson Jr. throughout his career. He's never averaged more than 7 rebounds a game in a season, and generally has been a pretty poor rebounder for a 6'11 big. With Steven Adams and Brandon Clarke out, all eyes now turn to Jaren to start dominating the glass, or the Grizzlies may get dominated on the glass. Outside of the reigning depoy, the Grizzlies will need some development and internal improvement from others. It can't all fall on Jaren. Xavier Tillman will be relied on heavily and will be the most obvious replacement for Steven Adams going forward, given he was his replacement last year. and he did a fine job. He averaged 7 points and 5 rebounds a game throughout the entirety of the season, but that jumps to 10 and 7 as a starter. Now he's only 6'8", which impacts his impact on the glass and on the defensive end, especially compared to the 6'11" Steven Adams. But the Grizzlies will be relying heavily on Tillman throughout next season, like it or not. He is their next best option to play alongside Jaren. A full season starting Tillman is a bit worrisome. Up to this point in his career, he's simply been a solid backup center, and he is good at that. He's a solid rebounder, he's a solid defender, he's even an underrated passer at the center position at times, whether it be out of the short roll or from the high post. But he's undersized at 6'8". He's quite big, he's quite strong, but he is a bit undersized, and he's simply not ideal as a starting center for a team that is continuing to push for a top 4 seed in the Western Conference year in and year out. Santi Aldama is the other man in the front court I expect the Grizzlies to rely on even more so this season, thanks to the injury of Steven Adams, and more prominently because of the injury to Brandon Clark. Aldama became a regular part of the rotation last year, playing 77 games and over 20 minutes a night, but they will need more than just some spacing and three-point shooting from him this year to make up some of the void that they're going to need to replace. Up to this point, Aldama has never been anything special on defense and has been a fine rebounder, but nothing really more than that. So despite the Grizzlies needing more from him this year, he's really not an ideal replacement for the role of Steven Adams or Brandon Clark. The third player returning who has an outside chance of filling the void in Memphis is Kenneth Lofton Jr. Now Lofton Jr. knows how to get a bucket. Man dropped 40 points in an NBA game. However, the issue is his height at 6'7" and his very poor defense. He gives up plenty of height on the defensive end, but he also has very poor lateral quicks. That combination defensively is going to be an issue, considering he often plays the power forward or center position. He may pick up some of the minutes that were left by Steven Adams and Brandon Clark simply out of desperation if they don't make any additions to this roster, but any minutes he play will offer a very different skill set, a very different role, and will certainly not benefit the rebounding or the defense that is going to be left out by Adams and Clark. The Grizzlies lack other great defensive options, great rebounders, and quite frankly even the size to adequately replace Steven Adams and Brandon Clark, which isn't surprising. I mean, we just mentioned that Steven Adams is one of the best rebounders in the league, and him and Jaren as a duo is one of the best defensive frontcourt duos in the league. So evidently they weren't going to have an easy replacement sitting on their bench, but it is now something they are going to have to contend with and manage throughout the remainder of this season. But they could also look to the trade market as a team that is still trying to compete for the postseason. They might not want to settle for Tillman and Aldama and Kenneth Lofton Jr. for the entirety of this season. The first option that comes to mind is the Atlanta Hawks. It always does for a center at this point in time, thanks to having two good centers in Onyeka Okongwu and Clint Capella. Both are very good rebounders and offer solid rim protection, and alongside Jaren Jackson Jr. would form a formidable defensive frontcourt whilst being a great lob threat for John Morant. The issues with those two options is for Capella, he has 2 years left on his deal, which poses a problem next year when Steven Adams is back. You could move off of one of them, but that would be its own dilemma. With Onyeka Okongwu, he is an impending restricted free agent, and he would have to get paid by the Grizzlies on top of Ja, Bane, Jaren, Adams, Brandon Clark. There would be a lot of money that would be going around. Otherwise, if they don't pay him, he would be walking for nothing. Another option the Grizzlies could explore is Robert Williams. Now, Robert Williams is locked up long term, but Williams is good enough that the argument could be made more so than for Capella or Okongwu that you should then trade off of Steven Adams next year or keep him as a high-level backup given the injury history of Robert Williams. The Grizzlies could look to package together some combination of Zaire Williams, David Roddy, Jake LaRavia, and picks to acquire the DPOY candidate center, and acquiring him would immediately give Memphis the best defensive frontcourt in the NBA. It's also possible the Grizzlies simply look to add another quality bench big as opposed to a starter. They could let Tillman be the starter and just look to have a little bit more size, a little bit more height, and a little bit more proven NBA experience in behind him. Kelly Olynyk from Utah could be an option as his role diminishes throughout the season in Utah. Wouldn't help the defense, but it's an option of a guy that they could look at. They may look at more defensive-minded options, or they may even look at a free agent like the likes of Bismack Biyombo. There's no guarantees they do anything, but don't be surprised if the Grizzlies look to add another big to help them throughout this season. The most important question is, how will the Grizzlies fare without Brandon Clarke and Steven Adams, and can they remain one of the best regular season teams in the Western Conference? As of the time of recording on October 22nd, no new trades have been made, no new free agency signings have been made. They're rolling with Jaren, Tillman, Santi Aldama, and potentially Kenneth Lofton. It's clear the Grizzlies' rebounding will take a hit, and their defense will fall off to some extent as well. I expect Tillman to fill in that void to a point, specifically defensively, but you can't replace the rebounding of Steven Adams. He's that elite. I still expect the defense to be very good thanks to Jaren Jackson Jr. Tillman should do much better replacing the defense of Steven Adams than the rebounding, but Jaren Jackson Jr. in of himself should make this Grizzlies defense great. We've seen in the past, whether it be Jaren, whether it be Rudy Gobert, elite bigs, elite rim protecting bigs, they can single-handedly make a defense a top 5 defense in the league. Jaren is that level of guy. Jaren is that level of impact on the defensive end. So the rebounding is of much more concern for the Grizzlies than is their defense. It's really not just the front court. Their depth as a whole is a problem this year. With no Steven Adams, with no Brandon Clarke, and Tyus Jones is gone from Marcus Smart, the Grizzlies now heavily rely on Santi Aldama, David Roddy, Zaire Williams, and possibly even Jake LaRavia or even G.G. Jackson if things really get desperate. If some of their young talent develops well, the Grizzlies could surprise everyone and stay amongst the best in the West. However, their depth could falter, and see the Grizzlies season falter with it. I personally believe the decline in rebounding will be the biggest negative impact for the Grizzlies, and won't be something they can replace to anywhere near the level of Steven Adams. But the Grizzlies always seem to find a way. Jaren always keeps this defense near or at an elite level, and Desmond Bane is one of the favorites for most improved player this season for a reason. There will likely be continued internal improvements. It might now be through the play-in tournament as opposed to clinching it outright, but expect the Grizzlies to find a way to once again be a playoff team.